My name is Amy Walsh. I'm 35 years old, and I'm a first lieutenant in the United States Army. In the suffocating silence of that Lancaster County, Nebraska courtroom, I never imagined the cruelest enemy I'd ever face would be my own brother. When his lawyer stood up in court and called me unstable, I thought I'd heard the worst of it. But then Gordon looked me dead in the eye, a smirk twisting his lips, and told the judge I was unworthy of our father's name. That one word, unworthy, cut deeper than any wound I'd ever carried. Moments later, his wife Clarissa turned to a neighbor sitting behind them and whispered just loud enough for me to hear, "Damaged goods always cause trouble." And in that moment, I realized my family wasn't just turning their backs on me, they wanted to erase me. But they didn't know one thing. My father, an old soldier himself, had seen this battle coming. Before I tell you my story, let me know where you're listening from in the comments, and hit subscribe if you've ever had your own family try to erase you just because you were different. The sharp crack of the judge's gavel echoed the shattering of my world. The sound hung in the air, a final percussive punctuation to my brother's lies. The hearing was adjourned. For a moment, I remained frozen on the hard wooden bench, my entire body numb. My training as a soldier, the years of discipline drilled into my very bones, kept my spine perfectly straight, my hands resting calmly in my lap. But inside, behind that carefully constructed wall of composure, I was hemorrhaging. Everything was breaking apart. I could hear the low murmur of voices around me, the rustle of clothing as people began to stand. My brother Gordon and his wife Clarissa were already accepting condolences like they were at a funeral. And in a way, they were. Mine. "It's just so sad," I heard a woman who used to babysit us say. "So sorry you two have to deal with her." Gordon responded with a heavy performative sigh, his voice thick with false grief. "We just want what's best for her," he said. Every word was a fresh wound. I could feel dozens of pairs of eyes drilling into my back. It wasn't sympathy I felt in their stares. It was a cold, morbid curiosity, the kind people have when they slow down to gawk at a horrific car wreck on the side of the highway. I was their roadside disaster, a spectacle of family drama laid bare for the entire town to consume. I didn't cry. Tears were a luxury I couldn't afford, a weakness they would feast upon. I just sat there, breathing in the stale air of the courtroom, and let the pain calcify into something hard and protective inside my chest. Finally, I forced my legs to move. Standing up felt like lifting a colossal weight. The walk from my seat to the courtroom's heavy oak doors was the longest, most agonizing journey of my life. Each step my boots took on the creaking floorboards seemed to echo through the silent room, a drumbeat marking my shame. One step, two steps, every head turned to watch. They weren't seeing Amy Walsh, the girl who'd grown up here, the soldier who'd served her country. They were seeing the woman who'd just been publicly branded as unstable, unworthy, and a problem to be dealt with. I pushed the door open, and the bright, unforgiving Nebraska afternoon sun hit me like a physical blow, forcing me to squint. And there they were. Gordon and Clarissa, standing on the top step of the courthouse, holding court. They were surrounded by a small group of neighbors and old family friends, their faces a mixture of pity and grim satisfaction. When Gordon saw me, his expression of concern deepened, but his eyes were cold and triumphant. He raised his voice just enough to carry across the courthouse lawn, a deliberate act of public execution. "We just hope she gets the help she so desperately needs," he announced to the crowd, shaking his head sadly. The words, wrapped in the guise of love, were the cruelest thing he could have said. It wasn't an attack. It was a character assassination disguised as kindness. I ignored them. I kept my gaze fixed on my old Ford pickup parked across the street and started walking. My path took me right down the center of Seward's Main Street, a street where I knew every crack in the sidewalk. I passed the Seward family diner, the greasy spoon where I'd waitressed every summer during high school to save for college. Through the large plate glass window, I saw Mr. Henderson, the owner who used to slip me extra pieces of pie, suddenly become intensely interested in wiping down an already clean counter, refusing to meet my eyes. A little further down, I passed the old pharmacy. I saw Mrs. Gable, my former Sunday school teacher, standing by her window. Our eyes met for a fraction of a second before she quickly, deliberately, pulled the floral curtain shut. That small, simple gesture hurt more than 1,000 insults. Their silence was their verdict. It was a universal language of rejection, spoken by the very people who had watched me grow up, who had cheered for me at graduation, who had waved flags when I left for my first deployment. My hometown was no longer my home. It had become enemy territory. By the time I reached my truck, my hands were trembling so violently I could barely fit the key into the ignition. I dropped it twice, the tinny sound of it hitting the asphalt mocking my lack of control. Finally, I slumped into the driver's seat, the worn vinyl cracked and familiar, and then my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out, expecting another hateful message, but the caller ID read, Captain Miller, my commanding officer. I took a shaky breath and answered, my voice a dry, hoarse whisper. Walsh! His voice was calm and steady, an anchor in my swirling ocean of chaos. First Lieutenant Walsh, he said. I heard there was some trouble back home. I just wanted you to know, your unit has your back. Whenever you're ready, your position is still here. His words didn't fix anything. They didn't erase the humiliation or the betrayal. But they were a lifeline. That simple statement of loyalty from a brother in arms 1,000 miles away was the only thing holding me together. In a world that had suddenly turned hostile, it was a reminder that I still belonged somewhere. I ended the call, started the engine, and pulled away from the curb. I drove past the town square, past the high school, past the edge of town where the cornfields began to stretch out toward the horizon. In my rearview mirror, the Seward water tower grew smaller and smaller until it disappeared completely. I didn't look back. There was nothing left for me there. An old piece of advice from my father surfaced in my mind, a lesson from a soldier to his daughter. Sometimes holding the line means knowing when to make a tactical retreat to regroup. I was retreating, but as the miles of empty highway unfolded before me, one single terrifying question echoed in the silence. Where do I go now? The endless miles of Nebraska asphalt blurred into a gray ribbon under my tires. I was driving on instinct, putting distance between me and the smoking crater that used to be my life in Seward. The question from an hour ago still hung in the cab of my truck, unanswered and suffocating. Where do I go now? My hands, still unsteady, gripped the steering wheel. I needed to do something, anything, to feel grounded. My eyes scanned the dashboard, the dusty vents, the radio that hadn't worked in years. I reached over and fumbled with the latch on the glove compartment, pulling it open with a tired squeak. Inside was a chaotic jumble of old registration papers, a half-eaten pack of gum, and a tire pressure gauge. My fingers dug past the clutter, searching for nothing in particular, and then they brushed against something soft and folded. Fabric. I pulled it out. It was a strip of royal blue satin, faded with age, the gold lettering nearly worn away. A Grand Champion blue ribbon from the Nebraska State Fair. And just like that, the highway, the truck, the gnawing emptiness of the present, it all dissolved. I was 16 years old again. That was the year of the General. He was a beautiful black Angus heifer, and he was my entire world. For a full year, my life revolved around him. My alarm went off at 4 a.m. every single day, long before the sun even thought about rising. While the rest of the world slept, I'd be in the barn, the cold of the Nebraska morning seeping through my jacket, my breath pluming in the air as I mixed his feed. I kept a detailed logbook, just like my dad had taught me, recording every pound of grain, every change in his mood. I'd even developed my own special blend of alfalfa hay, a secret recipe passed down from my father, who believed that true champions were built from the ground up, with hard work and attention to detail. I remembered my dad's words as he'd watched me nursing a sick calf back to health one spring. Hard work has its own value, Amy, he'd said, his voice quiet but firm. Even if no one else sees it, you know what you've done. The General wasn't just a 4-H project. He was the physical manifestation of that principle. He was my pride, my proof that I was capable, that I was more than just the quiet second-best child. He was my shot at being seen. The day of the competition at the Nebraska State Fair, I felt a nervous energy thrumming under my skin. The air was thick with the smells of grilled corn, spun sugar, and livestock. The distant screams from the midway rides mixed with the lowing of cattle in the exhibition halls, creating a chaotic symphony of summer. But in my mind, everything was quiet and focused. This was my moment. And then, it happened. The judge, a stern-faced man in a crisp white shirt and a cowboy hat, walked down the line of animals. He stopped in front of the general, walked around him, and then gave a slow, deliberate nod. "We have a winner," he announced into the microphone, and the entire arena seemed to erupt. They hung the heavy, magnificent blue ribbon around the general's neck, and I burst into tears, hugging his powerful neck with a joy so pure and overwhelming it felt like my heart would explode. I had done it. All the cold mornings, all the hard work, it had all been worth it. After the awards ceremony, I led the general back to his stall. I was so thirsty and giddy I decided to run to a concession stand to grab a celebratory lemonade. I was gone for maybe 5 minutes. When I came back, I froze in the entryway to the barn. My brother, Gordon, was standing by the stall, casually holding a pair of farm shears. And on the general's sleek black flank, there was a huge, ugly, jagged patch where the hair had been crudely hacked off, right down to the pink skin. It was a glaring wound on his otherwise perfect coat. My heart plummeted into my stomach. Gordon just shrugged, a familiar, lazy smirk on his face. "He looked a little messy," he said, his voice dripping with false innocence. "I was just tidying him up for you." But I knew better. I knew that look in his eyes. It was a calculated act of destruction, a deliberate, petty way to mar my victory, to steal the purity of my moment. It was his way of reminding me that he would never let me have anything that was solely mine. Tears of rage and hurt blurring my vision, I ran to find my mother. I found her fanning herself in the shade near the grandstand, laughing with one of her friends. I practically sobbed as the story tumbled out of me: the ribbon, the win, the shears, the ugly patch on the general's coat. I expected outrage. I expected her to march over there and confront Gordon, to defend my hard-earned victory. Instead, she let out a long, weary sigh, the kind she always reserved for my dramas. "Oh, Amy, don't be so dramatic," she said, her voice laced with annoyance. "Your brother was just trying to help. You're always so sensitive." Then she turned away from me, effectively dismissing my pain. I watched in stunned silence as she walked over to where Gordon was now standing, a tall, cold glass of lemonade in her hand. "Here you go, son," she said, her voice warm and comforting. "You look tired. Come sit down for a minute." In that single devastating moment, the pain of seeing the general's ruined coat was nothing compared to the agony that ripped through my chest. My mother hadn't just ignored my pain. She had actively chosen his side. She had comforted the vandal and punished the victim. She had looked at my masterpiece and his act of defacement and decided that his comfort was more important than my heartbreak. The long truck ride home that night was shrouded in a thick, suffocating silence. The giant trophy sat on the seat between me and Gordon, a monument to a spoiled victory. The blue ribbon lay on the dashboard, its color seeming to mock me. I stared out the window at the endless cornfields, my throat tight with unspoken grief. Then I felt a movement from the front seat. My father, who had been driving without a word, reached his right arm back, his eyes never leaving the road. His large, calloused hand searched for a moment before finding mine. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He simply squeezed my hand, a firm, powerful pressure that spoke volumes. It said, "I see you. I know what you did. And I am so proud of you." That silent acknowledgement from my father didn't fix the hurt, but it became a quiet cornerstone of my soul. It was a reminder that my worth wasn't determined by the approval of those who chose not to see it. Back in my truck, on that lonely stretch of highway, I reached out and gently touched the faded blue ribbon. The memory was a fresh wound, a painful map that explained how I'd ended up right here, right now, once again deemed unworthy by the two people who should have been my greatest champions. I ended up in Lincoln. It was only an hour's drive from Seward, but it felt like a different planet. The anonymity of the city was a harsh but necessary medicine. Here, I wasn't Gordon Walsh's unstable sister. I was just another face in the crowd, and that was a kind of freedom. My new life was contained within the four thin walls of a studio apartment on the second floor of a walk-up that always smelled faintly of stale cigarette smoke and the previous tenant's cat. My worldly possessions had been reduced to what could fit in my army-issue duffel bag, a few sets of civilian clothes, and a single framed photograph of my father in his dress uniform. There was no bed, no table, no chairs, just a sleeping bag on the floor and a makeshift desk made from a cardboard box. My new reality was a world away from the command and respect of being a first lieutenant. To pay the rent and keep the lights on, I took a job at an Amazon fulfillment center on the outskirts of the city. 10-hour shifts on my feet, walking miles on concrete floors, scanning, lifting, and packing boxes in a sea of other anonymous workers. It was humbling, grueling work, and every night I'd come home with an ache so deep in my bones, it felt like it had settled into my soul. Dinner was usually a box of Kraft mac and cheese I'd pick up from the local Hy-Vee, which I ate sitting on the floor, my back against the wall. The silence in that little room was the loudest thing I'd ever heard. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of solitude, it was a vast, crushing emptiness, a constant roaring reminder that I was utterly and completely alone. I was holding the line, just like my father had taught me, but the front was a desolate, lonely place. The weeks blurred into a monotonous cycle of work, eat, sleep. Then, a few weeks before Christmas, something arrived in the mail that broke the routine. It was a crisp, red envelope addressed to me in the familiar, looping cursive of my Aunt Susan, my mother's sister from out of state. It was her annual family Christmas card. For a foolish, hopeful moment, my heart lifted. It was a connection, a small sign that I hadn't been completely cast out. I tore it open with a sense of anticipation I hadn't felt in months. Inside, the photo was glossy and perfect. Gordon, Clarissa, and their two smiling children were posed in front of the Walsh farmhouse, framed by wreaths and festive lights. They looked like the perfect American family, happy and whole. I scanned to the bottom of the card, looking for the handwritten note Aunt Susan always included. But all I found was the pre-printed message in a cheerful, generic font. Merry Christmas from the Walsh family. My name wasn't there. I read it again and again, as if the words might change. The Walsh family. It was a formal declaration. I was no longer a part of that unit. They had literally cropped me out of the picture. The feeling that hit me was sharp and physical, like a fist slamming into my sternum, knocking all the air from my lungs. I sank down onto the floor, the card trembling in my hand, the smiling faces of the family I no longer had staring up at me. A few days later, my phone rang. It was Clarissa. I almost didn't answer, but some morbid curiosity made me press the green button. Her voice was syrupy sweet, a tone I knew meant she wanted something. "Amy, honey, how are you?" she began. "I'm fine, Clarissa," I said, my voice as flat and cold as the tile floor beneath me. "Oh, good," she chirped. "Listen, Mom just wanted me to call and make sure you got the Christmas card. Aunt Susan said she'd sent one your way." The calculated cruelty of it stole my breath. "I got it," I managed to say. "Oh, wonderful. The kids miss you so much, you know," she continued, the lie sliding effortlessly from her tongue. "They keep asking when Aunt Amy is coming home." She paused, letting the emotional bait hang in the air for a moment before delivering the real reason for her call. "By the way, have you had a chance to reconsider signing those papers? It would just make things so much easier for everyone if we could put this all behind us before the holidays." And there it was. The card wasn't an oversight. It wasn't a mistake. It was a weapon. It was a psychological operation designed to remind me of everything I had lost, to make me feel so lonely and desperate that I would surrender the one thing I had left, my father's legacy, just to be allowed back into the cold illusion of their family. It was a reminder of what I could have back, if only I would sign my life away. I ended the call without another word. The silence that followed was different. It wasn't empty anymore. It was filled with a cold, clear understanding of what I was up against. It was psychological warfare. And at that moment, I felt completely and utterly alone. If you've ever felt that kind of calculated coldness from someone who was supposed to love you, support this story with a like, and just type, "I see you" in the comments so others know they aren't alone either. That night, sleep was impossible. I sat on the floor and pulled out the small framed photo of my father. I looked into his eyes, steady and kind, and remembered something else he used to say. "Bullies only win," he'd told me once after I'd come home from school crying, "when you let them define who you are." I thought about the man in the picture, a man who had faced down real enemies, and then I thought about the quote from Theodore Roosevelt he'd framed on his office wall: "Do what you can, with what you have, where you are." The raw, aching pain from the Christmas card began to transform, hardening from a fragile grief into a cold, diamond-hard fury. They would not win. They would not define me, and they would not erase me. I would not let them. My father had left me more than a farm. He'd left me a backbone. I stood up, my body no longer feeling tired, and walked over to the cardboard box that served as my desk. I pulled out a pen and a clean sheet of paper. I was done reacting. I was done being the victim. I started to write. It wasn't a letter of surrender. It was a battle plan. They didn't just want the farm. They wanted to erase any trace that I ever existed. And I was about to show them just how hard a ghost could fight back. My battle plan, drafted in the cold fury of my lonely apartment, felt less like a strategy and more like a suicide mission. The fury had given me focus, but it hadn't given me reinforcements. After a few more weeks of the grueling 10-hour shifts and silent dinners on the floor, the loneliness started to eat away at the edges of my resolve. It was a corrosive acid, and I knew if I let it, it would dissolve my backbone completely. I needed to be around people who understood the language of service, who knew what it meant to hold a line. I needed to be around soldiers. One evening after work, instead of driving back to my empty apartment, I found myself pulling up Google Maps and typing in 3 letters, VFW. The closest one was Post 131, a squat brick building on the other side of Lincoln. My heart hammered against my ribs as I parked my truck. I almost put the key back in the ignition and drove away. What was I even doing here? Walking into a room full of strangers felt like exposing a raw nerve. But the thought of another night alone in that silent room was worse. I took a deep breath, got out of the truck, and walked toward the door. The moment I pushed it open, a wave of familiar sensations washed over me. It wasn't a smell of luxury or comfort, but of authenticity. The air was thick with the scent of weak, percolated coffee and the faint, malty aroma of stale beer. It smelled like every VFW hall I'd ever been in with my father. The lighting was dim, the wood-paneled walls covered with history. Faded American flags stood proudly in the corners, their edges slightly frayed. Black and white photographs of young men in uniform from forgotten wars stared out from dusty frames, their eyes full of a resolve I recognized. It wasn't fancy, but it was real. A couple of older men, grizzled veterans with worn-out ball caps, were playing a quiet game of cards at a corner table. Another sat alone, engrossed in a newspaper. When I stepped inside, they all looked up. But their gazes were different from the ones I'd endured in Seward. There was no morbid curiosity, no judgment. Just a quiet, appraising look, followed by a slight, almost imperceptible nod of acknowledgement. Here, my military bearing wasn't something to be suspicious of. It was a common language. As I stood there awkwardly, a man detached himself from the bar and walked toward me. He was built like a retired heavyweight, with a full head of silver-white hair and the broad, solid shoulders of a lifelong soldier. His face was a roadmap of wrinkles, but his eyes were sharp and clear. "You look a little lost, Lieutenant," he said, his voice a low, warm rumble. The word, Lieutenant, hit me with surprising force. He hadn't seen a broken woman. He'd seen a rank, an identity I was proud of. He stuck out a hand that felt like a leather work glove. "They call me Sarge," he said. "Sarge Henderson, Marine Corps, Vietnam." I shook his hand. "Amy Walsh, Army." I was still on high alert, my internal defenses raised. But as I looked into his eyes, I saw something that disarmed me, an unspoken understanding. He didn't ask what I was doing there, or why I looked like I was carrying the weight of the world. He didn't pry or push. He just saw me. He took in my worn-out work clothes, the exhaustion etched onto my face, and asked the simplest, kindest question I had heard in months. "Have you eaten dinner?" I think I just shook my head, unable to speak past the lump forming in my throat. "Well, that won't do," he said decisively. "Come on. My wife Maria always makes too much. Let's go." Before I could protest, he was leading me out the door and to his old pickup truck. We drove to a small, tidy house in a quiet suburban neighborhood. The moment we walked in, I was enveloped by the warm, incredible smell of roasting beef and spices. A woman with a kind face, warm brown eyes, and a welcoming smile came out of the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. This was Maria. She looked from Sarge to me, and her smile widened. She didn't ask who I was or why I was there. She just opened her arms and gave me a hug, as if I were one of her own children coming home. "Welcome, mija," she said softly. "You are just in time." Maria didn't pepper me with questions. She just sat me down at her small kitchen table and placed a heavy ceramic plate in front of me. It was piled high with steaming beef stew, rich with carrots and potatoes, next to a piece of golden, homemade cornbread, butter already melting into its surface. It was the first real meal, the first home-cooked food I'd had in months. As I took the first bite, the warmth of the stew spread through me, chasing away a chill I didn't even realize I had. It was more than just food, it was nourishment for a starving soul. The simple, unconditional kindness of these two strangers began to melt at the thick ice that had formed around my heart. After dinner, while Maria clattered softly in the kitchen, cleaning up, Sarge led me out to the small back porch. He handed me a steaming mug of black coffee, and we sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the sound of crickets in the cooling night air. "I don't know what kind of battle you're fighting, Amy," he said finally, his gaze fixed on the dark outline of his backyard. "But I know this. No soldier fights alone. The family you're born into, you don't get to choose them. But the family you serve with, the one you fight alongside, the one you choose to stand with, that's the one that matters. That's your real squad." His words didn't offer a solution, but they opened a door in my mind. The isolation I felt wasn't a life sentence. It was a tactical problem. I wasn't alone. I was just a soldier who had been separated from her unit on a new and unfamiliar battlefield. My mission now was to find my squad. As I looked up, I noticed a small brass plaque on the wall of the porch. It was a quote from an old general, George S. Patton. "Success is not measured by what you accomplish," it read, "but by the opposition you have encountered and the courage with which you have maintained the struggle against overwhelming odds." For the first time in a long time, I felt a flicker of hope. I wasn't just surviving anymore, I was fighting. For the first time in months, I walked up the stairs to my apartment with a feeling that wasn't dread. The warmth from Sarge and Maria's kitchen seemed to linger with me, a protective shield against the loneliness that usually greeted me at the door. I had a squad, or at least the beginnings of one. I had a battle plan. I had hope. I unlocked my door, stepped inside, and was about to flick on the light when I was stopped by a sharp rap on the door I'd just closed. My heart leaped into my throat. I wasn't expecting anyone. I peered through the peephole, and the fragile warmth inside me instantly turned to ice. It was Gordon and Clarissa. They were standing in the dim hallway, beaming, a large wicker basket laden with goodies held between them. My entire body went rigid. This was my safe space, my bunker, and the enemy was at the gate. I took a half-second to compose myself, plastering a neutral expression on my face, and opened the door. "Amy!" Gordon's voice was a booming, sickeningly cheerful sound that was far too large for the narrow hallway. "There you are, sis. We were so worried about you. Mom insisted we drive down and check in." He didn't wait for an invitation. He and Clarissa swept past me into my tiny apartment, bringing with them the scent of Clarissa's expensive perfume and the overwhelmingly sweet smell of fresh pastries from the basket. It was a full-scale invasion. Clarissa's eyes did a slow, deliberate sweep of my studio, taking in the sleeping bag on the floor and the cardboard box I used as a table. A look of perfectly crafted pity crossed her face. "Oh, Amy," she said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "You're living here? It's so cozy." The word cozy was a dagger wrapped in velvet. The basket was placed on my floor, the only available surface. I recognized the logo on the wax paper wrapping instantly. The Rabbit Hole Bakery, our favorite spot in Seward. It was a calculated move, a Trojan horse filled with nostalgia, designed to remind me of a home they were now dangling in front of me like a prize. They settled onto my sleeping bag as if it were a sofa, forcing me to stand. The interrogation began, masked as concern. Gordon started the performance, his face a mask of regret. He talked about misunderstandings and the pressure he'd been under. He claimed he had overreacted in court, that he'd only ever wanted to protect me. It was a masterful, blame-shifting monologue that painted him as the burdened older brother, forced to make a difficult choice for my own good. Then Clarissa tagged in. She reached out and took my hand. Her skin was soft, her touch gentle, but it felt like a trap. "We're family, Amy," she said, her eyes welling up with crocodile tears. "And families fight sometimes, but they're still family at the end of the day. Mom misses you so much. And Dad?" She let her voice break, a theatrical pause for effect. "If Dad were still here, this would break his heart. He wouldn't want to see us like this." They were using my parents as weapons, twisting my love for them into a tool for my own surrender. I felt the carefully constructed walls around my heart begin to tremble. A small, exhausted part of me, the part that was so tired of fighting, so tired of being alone, wanted to believe them. Maybe it was all a misunderstanding. Maybe I was being too sensitive. The thought was a seductive poison. I remembered a lesson from a psychological warfare training I'd attended at Fort Huachuca. The instructor had said, "Your enemy will always attack what they perceive to be your weakest point, your hope and your compassion. Turn them into your armor. Don't let them become your burden." Just as I felt myself starting to sway, Gordon delivered what he thought was the final, decisive blow. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial, man-to-man tone. "Listen," he said. "I've been talking to the lawyer. There's a way we can make all of this go away, nice and clean. You just have to sign a small agreement, a settlement. I'll make sure you're taken care of. We'll set you up with a monthly allowance, a generous one. You won't have to work in that warehouse anymore." He gestured vaguely, as if the place were contaminated. "You can have a peaceful life." Clarissa squeezed my hand. "And you can come home," she added, her voice a soft, tempting whisper. "You can be part of the family again." The offer hung in the air, shimmering like a mirage in the desert. A life without the bone-deep ache from my job. A life without the crushing loneliness. A life without this fight. It was everything the exhausted part of me craved. It was an easy way out. My resolve wavered. I was so tired. Maybe it was worth it just to make it all stop. I almost said yes. I almost surrendered. But then, I saw it. It was a fleeting, almost imperceptible thing. As Gordon finished his sales pitch, his eyes flicked toward Clarissa for a fraction of a second. It was a look of shared, smug triumph. A look that said, "We've got her." And in that instant, the fog of their manipulation vanished. My vision became crystal clear. This wasn't an act of kindness. This was a closing tactic in a negotiation. They weren't offering me a home. They were offering me a gilded cage. They didn't want their sister back. They wanted my signature on a legal document that would make me disappear quietly and permanently. The memory of Sarge's back porch, the taste of Maria's beef stew, the feeling of genuine, unconditional kindness. It all came rushing back. A powerful antidote to the poison they were trying to feed me. I knew the difference between real family and a performance. And this was a 3-act tragedy of lies. I pulled my hand from Clarissa's grasp. I took a deep, steadying breath, letting it fill my lungs with the stale air of my own independent life. The silence stretched, thick with their anticipation. I looked my brother dead in the eye. "No," I said. The word was quiet, but it landed in the small room with the force of a grenade. It was calm, definitive, and absolute. My answer is no. My quiet two-letter word of defiance shattered the fragile peace talks in my apartment. Gordon's face, which had been a mask of concerned brotherly love, collapsed into something ugly and real. The warmth vanished from his eyes, replaced by a familiar, cold fury. Clarissa gasped theatrically, as if I'd just slapped her. They left without another word. The rabbit hole bakery basket abandoned on my floor like an unexploded bomb. For a few days, an unnerving silence followed. I knew it was the calm before the storm. Gordon was not a man who took no for an answer. The storm broke on a Tuesday evening under the harsh, buzzing fluorescent lights of a Walmart supercenter parking lot. I had just finished a grueling shift at the warehouse and was on my way home, making a quick stop for groceries. I was loading the last of the plastic bags into the bed of my truck, my muscles aching, my mind already on the blissful emptiness of my apartment. That's when their SUV screeched into the empty space behind me, blocking me in. My whole body tensed. Gordon flung his door open and stomped toward me. The mask was completely gone now. His face was twisted into a snarl of pure, unfiltered rage. Clarissa got out on the passenger side, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her expression one of utter contempt. "What the hell do you think you're doing, Amy?" he roared, his voice echoing in the vast, mostly empty lot. A couple pushing a shopping cart a few rows over stopped and stared. "Who do you think you are, turning down my kindness like that?" Kindness? The word was so absurd, so twisted, that for a second I almost laughed. I closed the tailgate of my truck with a loud slam, the sound punctuating the tense silence. I kept my voice low and even, the way I would with an unstable civilian overseas. De-escalate. "I already gave you my answer, Gordon," I said, trying to move around him toward my driver's side door. "Please, just leave me alone." He sidestepped, blocking my path. He was bigger than me, and he used his physical presence to intimidate, puffing out his chest. He let out a short, ugly laugh that held no humor. "Leave you alone?" he sneered. "You started this. You're the one who couldn't just be grateful. But I'm going to give you one last chance." He lowered his voice, leaning in so only I could hear the venom in his words. "You're going to sign those papers, or I swear to God the first call I make will be to your commanding officer. I'll send him your medical file, all of it. I'll tell him you're a danger to yourself and a liability to your own unit. You won't just lose the farm, Amy. You will lose everything." And that was it. The breaking point. The final straw. The drop of water that made the dam burst. In that moment, he wasn't just my greedy, manipulative brother anymore. He was an enemy combatant who had just crossed a sacred line. He wasn't just threatening my inheritance. He was threatening my honor. He was threatening my career. He was threatening the integrity of the United States Army and the safety of the soldiers I was sworn to lead. He was threatening the only part of my life that I had built for myself, the one thing that was truly mine, the one place I'd always been judged on my merit, not my gender or my family's twisted dynamics. Something inside me, a core of compressed rage and pain I'd been sitting on for months, for years really, finally detonated. It was a white-hot, silent explosion that burned away all the fear, all the hurt, all the self-doubt. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I simply stopped reacting and started acting. It was pure instinct, the honed reflex of a soldier cornered and left with no option but to attack. I took one deliberate step forward, closing the distance between us. I squared my shoulders and looked him directly in the eye. For the first time in my life, I wasn't his bullied little sister. My gaze was as cold and hard as polished steel. And for the first time, I saw a flicker of fear in his eyes. He actually took a half step back. My voice, when it came out, wasn't loud. It was low, controlled, and lethal. Every word was a carefully aimed shot. "You listen to me very carefully, Gordon," I said. The sound of his own name, spoken with such icy command, made him flinch. "You can try to take the money. You can try to steal the land. You can lie to this entire town and poison them against me. I don't care. But you will never, ever touch my uniform." I took another step closer, forcing him back again. Clarissa's smug expression had melted into one of genuine shock. "This game you've been playing is over," I continued, my voice unwavering. "I will see you in court. And I swear to you, I'm not just going to win. I am going to dismantle every single lie you've ever told. I will make sure the whole world knows exactly what kind of man you are." The air crackled with the aftermath of my declaration. Gordon stared at me, his mouth slightly agape, utterly speechless. He had poked the bear one too many times, and now he was facing a creature he didn't recognize and didn't know how to fight. If you have ever had a moment where you finally stood up and found your voice against someone who tried to silence you, hit that like button to stand with Amy. And in the comments, just write "Game on." Without another word, I turned my back on them. It was a dismissal, absolute and final. I walked to my truck door, got in, and started the engine. I didn't look at them in my rearview mirror as I pulled out of the parking space and drove away, leaving them standing there, two stunned statues under the cold, unforgiving lights of the Walmart parking lot. The adrenaline coursed through my veins, but my hands were perfectly steady on the steering wheel. The rage had burned itself out, leaving behind a cold, clear sense of purpose. I knew exactly what I had to do. I pulled my phone out, found the number I needed, and pressed call. It rang twice before he picked up. "David Chen," a professional voice said. "David," I said, my own voice firm and clear. "It's Amy Walsh. We have a problem, and we're going on the offensive. Now." The phone call to David Chen felt like calling in air support. David and I had gone through JAG training together, two green lieutenants trying to make sense of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. He'd since left the service and was now a partner at a high-powered civil law firm in Omaha. But he still thought like a soldier. As I laid out the entire situation for him on speakerphone, pacing the length of my tiny apartment, I didn't just give him the emotional story, I gave him a mission brief. I detailed the timeline, the false allegations, and finally, Gordon's threat in the Walmart parking lot. I expected him to talk about slander or family court procedures. Instead, there was a long, sharp silence on the other end of the line. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost all its civilian softness and was replaced by the crisp, analytical tone of a prosecutor. "Amy, listen to me," he said. His threat to use those fake medical documents. That wasn't just a threat. The moment he created a fraudulent government document, specifically a VA record, he committed a federal crime. This is no longer a family dispute over a will. He's escalated the conflict onto a whole new battlefield. We've got him. Hearing David say that changed everything. It validated my outrage. This wasn't just a messy family fight, it was a felony. My brother wasn't just a bully, he was a criminal. "We need concrete evidence, David," I said, my mind already shifting into tactical mode. "It's his word against mine." "Then we need to find it," he replied. After we hung up, I started doing what the Army had trained me to do: intelligence preparation of the battlefield. I analyzed my adversary. Gordon's strengths were his ruthlessness and his ability to manipulate people. His weakness was his arrogance. He believed he was smarter than everyone else, especially me. But as I mapped out my strategy, a memory surfaced, a ghost of a conversation with my father a few years ago, back when his mind was still sharp. We were sitting on the porch, and he was talking about a neighbor's dispute. "When the fox is in the henhouse, Amy," he'd said, looking out at the fields, "you look in the book about Gettysburg." It was a code. It had to be. My father was a huge Civil War buff, and his office was lined with books, but his definitive multi-volume set on the Battle of Gettysburg was his pride and joy. I knew what I had to do. That night, under the cover of a cold, clear Nebraska sky, I drove my truck back towards Seward. I didn't go into town. Instead, I parked on a gravel service road a mile from the farm, the same way we used to do as kids when we'd sneak out. I pulled on a dark hoodie and set off on foot, the harvested corn stalks crunching under my boots, the pale moonlight casting long, skeletal shadows across the fields. My heart was pounding, a frantic drumbeat in my chest. It was a strange and bitter feeling, moving like an intruder across the land that was supposed to be mine. The farmhouse was dark. I crept around to the back of the house, to the window of my old bedroom. It always had a loose latch. With a soft groan of protesting wood, it slid open, and I slipped inside. The house felt alien. Clarissa's touch was everywhere. New curtains, generic decorative pillows on my old window seat, the faint, cloying scent of potpourri. It was like walking through a sterile imitation of my own memories. Barefoot on the cold hardwood floors, I moved like a ghost down the hallway to my father's office. I slipped inside and closed the door behind me, my hand shaking slightly. This room, at least, was almost exactly as he'd left it. The faint smell of old books and his pipe tobacco still lingered in the air. His heavy oak desk, his leather chair, the photos on the wall. It was a sanctuary of memory. My eyes went straight to the bookshelf, and there it was, the thick, leather-bound volume on Gettysburg. My fingers trembled as I pulled the heavy book from the shelf. It felt lighter than it should have. I opened it, and my breath caught. The center of the pages had been hollowed out with surgical precision, and nestled inside, resting on a bed of cut-out words about Pickett's charge, was a small, ornate, old-fashioned skeleton key. I knew instantly what it was for. My dad had always talked about the one loose floorboard under his desk, the one that always creaked. I knelt, ran my fingers along the seams of the old oak planks, and found it. Using the tip of a letter opener, I pried it up. And there, in the dark space beneath, was a gray metal lockbox. The old key fit perfectly. With a dull click, the lock turned. I lifted the lid, my heart hammering against my ribs. On top was the trust and the will, the documents I already knew about. But underneath them was something else. It was a thick, leather-bound ledger, a journal. It was my father's handwriting, neat and precise. I opened it. Page after page, he had meticulously documented everything. Every single dollar he had loaned Gordon for a failed business venture, with dates and amounts marked unpaid. Every promise Gordon had made and broken. There were entries detailing his disappointment, his frustration, his slow, painful realization of his own son's character. It was a secret history of my brother's greed and my father's quiet sorrow. But it was the last page that shattered me. Tucked into a small envelope was a handwritten letter addressed to me. "My dearest Amy," it began, "I pray you never have to read this. I truly do. But if you are holding this letter, it means the fox has finally taken over the hen house. It means Gordon has chosen his path, and I am no longer there to guide him back. I have left you the farm, and I know he will fight you for it. So I have left you this too. Remember what I taught you. Holding the line doesn't mean you have to endure the shelling alone. You must fight back with superior firepower. Use what I've left you here. This is your ammunition. Now, go win this war." Tears. I didn't even know I was holding back began to stream down my face, dripping onto the brittle pages. He had known. He had seen it all coming, and he had armed me from beyond the grave. This wasn't just a ledger, it was a weapon. This wasn't just a letter, it was my father's final command. I carefully placed everything back in the box, slipped it into a canvas bag, and left the house the same way I came. As I walked back across the moonlit fields, the cold metal of the box felt heavy and real in my hands. I reached inside my pocket and closed my fist around the old skeleton key. It was no longer just a key. It was my father's faith in me, made solid. It was the key to my victory. The day of the final hearing, I walked into the courtroom feeling a strange sense of calm. The fear and humiliation that had once suffocated me in this very room were gone, replaced by the cold, clear focus of a soldier before a mission. I didn't look at my brother. I didn't look at the familiar faces from Seward filling the benches behind him. I looked at the American flag standing behind the judge's bench, and I silently recited my oath of commission. I wasn't just fighting for a farm anymore. I was fighting for every soldier whose honor had been questioned by people who would never understand the meaning of the word. Gordon's lawyer began, his voice oozing with confidence. He presented the forged medical documents with a flourish, stacking them neatly on the witness stand. Then Gordon took the stand, his face a perfect portrait of brotherly anguish. He launched into a heart-wrenching monologue about his sleepless nights, his worry for his troubled sister, and his solemn duty to protect me from myself. He dabbed at his dry eyes with a handkerchief. "I love my sister," he said, his voice thick with emotion as he looked toward the jury box. "That's why I have to do this. It's the hardest thing I've ever had to do." A ripple of sympathetic murmurs went through the gallery. Behind him, Clarissa played her part perfectly, dabbing at her own eyes with a silk handkerchief. They were putting on an award-winning performance, and the entire room was captivated. Then, it was our turn. My lawyer, David Chen, stood up. He didn't argue. He didn't object. He simply walked to the podium with a calm, almost serene confidence. "Your Honor," he said, "we have no questions for Mr. Walsh at this time. The defense calls its first witness, Mr. Marcus Thorne." A man in a crisp dark suit walked to the stand. He carried an air of no-nonsense authority. He was sworn in, and David began. "Mr. Thorne, could you please state your occupation for the court?" "I am a senior investigator for the Department of Veterans Affairs, Office of the Inspector General." A subtle shift occurred in the room. This wasn't a hired expert. This was a federal agent. David had him authenticate Gordon's submitted documents, which were projected onto a large screen for everyone to see. Mr. Thorne, in a dry, clinical monotone, began the systematic execution of my brother's lies. "The form used here, VA Form 1010EE, he began, pointing to the screen, "is a version that was discontinued 5 years ago." Gordon's face tightened. "The signature of the attending physician, Dr. Alastair Finch," Thorne continued, his voice unwavering, "is a forgery. We contacted Dr. Finch, who is retired in Arizona. He confirmed he has not practiced medicine in 7 years and has never had First Lieutenant Walsh as a patient." A gasp rippled through the gallery. Gordon's face began to lose its color. "And finally," Thorne said, delivering the final blow, "the official seal from the Omaha VA Medical Center is counterfeit. The authentic seal has a microscopic flaw in the letter H of health. This counterfeit seal is perfect. It's a common mistake made by amateurs." Each statement was a nail being hammered into the coffin of Gordon's credibility. The room was silent, the air thick with tension. Gordon was visibly sweating now, his smug confidence replaced by a dawning panic. But David wasn't finished. He let Mr. Thorne step down and then turned to the judge. "Your Honor," he said, his voice resonating with a new power, "the opposition has spent this entire hearing attempting to paint a picture of my client, First Lieutenant Walsh, as a soldier broken by war. We would now like to present the court with a different picture." An aide dimmed the lights. A grainy, chaotic image flickered to life on the projection screen. It was a photo from Afghanistan, taken in the middle of an ambush. A Humvee was on fire, black smoke pouring from its engine, and in the center of the frame, a young soldier, me, was dragging a wounded civilian man away from the burning vehicle, shielding him with my own body as dust and debris kicked up from enemy fire around us. The image was raw, terrifying, and heroic. "This man," David said, his voice echoing in the silent room, "was a civilian contractor embedded with our unit. He was gravely wounded when his vehicle was hit. The soldier who pulled him from that burning wreckage under active enemy fire, saving his life at immense personal risk, was First Lieutenant Amy Walsh." He let the image hang in the air, a stark rebuttal to every lie they had told. He let everyone in that room see who I really was. I could feel Gordon's stare, now filled with pure, unadulterated hatred. Then David paused, a master of theatrical timing, and prepared to deliver the killing blow. "And the civilian man whose life was saved that day," he said, his voice dropping slightly, drawing everyone in. He pointed to the grainy figure in the photo, then turned his hand slowly toward the bench. "Is you, Your Honor, Judge Ellison." A collective audible gasp swept through the courtroom, a sound of 100 people sucking in their breath at once. A deathly, absolute silence followed. Every single eye in the room swiveled from the photograph on the screen to the man sitting on the bench. Gordon's face went completely white, the color of bleached bone. Clarissa's mouth hung open in a silent, horrified, "Oh!" Judge Ellison, who had been sitting ramrod straight, slowly, deliberately, took off his reading glasses. He placed them carefully on the bench in front of him. He stared at the picture on the screen for a long moment, then his eyes moved and locked with mine. The look in his eyes was no longer that of an impartial arbiter of the law. It was the look of a man seeing a ghost from his past. It was the look of a man who owed his life to the woman standing before him. He gave a slow, solemn, almost imperceptible nod. It was a nod of recognition, of confirmation, of gratitude. In that single silent gesture, the war was over. The game was finished. And I had won. The silence in the courtroom was a living thing. It was thick, heavy, and absolute. For a long moment, the only sound was the faint hum of the overhead lights. Judge Ellison slowly put his glasses back on, and in that simple motion, his entire demeanor shifted. The look of personal recognition was gone, replaced by the formidable authority of the bench. The judge was back in control. He cleared his throat, and the sound was like a thunderclap in the stillness. He fixed his gaze not on me, but on Gordon's lawyer. "Counselor for the plaintiff," he said, his voice dangerously calm and laced with steel, "I strongly suggest you reconsider your client's entire petition. Before the U.S. Attorney's Office has a conversation with him about the penalties for fabricating federal documents." The threat was unmistakable, a public and lethal blow. Gordon's lawyer paled, stammering something incoherent. But Gordon, pushed past the point of reason, leaped to his feet. "She ruined everything," he shrieked, his voice cracking with desperation and fury. He pointed a trembling finger at me. "She's the one who's sick. She belongs in a hospital." But no one was listening anymore. His credibility had been incinerated. As two bailiffs began to move purposefully toward him, Clarissa finally broke. It was a complete and total collapse. She shot up from her seat, her face a mess of smeared mascara and genuine terror. "Stop it, Gordon. Just stop. It's over," she sobbed. She turned her tear-streaked face to the judge. "Your Honor, I signed the affidavits. He told me it was just a formality, a procedural thing. I didn't know. I'm so sorry." Her confession was the final betrayal, the last nail in his coffin. But this time, the betrayal wasn't aimed at me. It was aimed at him. The sight of his own wife turning on him seemed to finally break Gordon completely. The fight drained out of him, leaving behind a hollow shell. He collapsed back into his chair, a man utterly defeated, his empty eyes staring at nothing. The judge called for a recess. As the courtroom began to empty, David Chen put a steadying hand on my shoulder and guided me out a side door into a small, sterile waiting room. The space was cold and impersonal, with gray walls and uncomfortable plastic chairs. It felt like a place where things ended. A few minutes later, the door opened and Gordon walked in. He looked 10 years older. The arrogant, confident man was gone, replaced by someone I barely recognized. A bitter, hollowed-out stranger. He stopped a few feet away from me, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "Are you happy now?" he hissed, his voice raw with a defeated rage. "You got what you wanted. You've taken everything from me." I looked into my brother's eyes and felt something I never expected to feel. Not fear, not anger, not even satisfaction. Just a deep, profound pity. I saw a man so consumed by jealousy and entitlement that he had burned his own life to the ground just to try and ruin mine. "You did this to yourself, Gordon," I said, my voice quiet and devoid of accusation. It was just a statement of fact. I never wanted the farm. I just wanted my brother. A flicker of something, pain, shame, crossed his face before being replaced by his familiar sneer. I didn't wait for a response. There was nothing left to say. I had just spoken the eulogy for our relationship. I turned and walked out of the room, leaving him alone with the ruins of his own making. In the hallway, Clarissa intercepted me, her face puffy and desperate. She grabbed my arm. "Amy, please," she begged. "Think about the children. What about my kids?" This was her last, desperate move, using her children as human shields. I stopped and looked at her, at this woman who had sat silently by, who had whispered insults about me, who had been a willing accomplice right up until the moment she saw the ship sinking. And I felt Nothing. The well of emotion had run dry. I am sorry for your children, Clarissa. I truly am, I said, and I meant it. They were the innocent casualties in a war they didn't start. But from this moment forward, I am no longer his sister, and I am no longer their aunt. I gently removed her hand from my arm. I'm just a stranger who happens to share the Walsh name. Good luck to you. I walked away without looking back. Each step I took down that long marble hallway felt lighter than the one before. It was the feeling of a massive, crushing weight being lifted from my shoulders, a burden I'd carried my entire life. My mother used to read the Bible to us, back before her grief had hardened her. A verse came back to me now, from the book of John. Then you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. I had found the truth, and I was free. But I realized now that freedom wasn't a joyful explosion. It was a quiet, sober, and deeply painful amputation. I had just willingly cut off a part of myself to save the rest. Later that afternoon, I met David at his temporary office in Lincoln. The case was effectively over. Gordon, facing federal charges, had dropped the suit. The farm, the land, my father's legacy, it was all legally mine. David slid a small manila envelope across the polished table. The original keys to the farmhouse, he said with a smile. They're yours. I opened the envelope and tipped the keys into my palm. They were old and heavy, worn smooth with time. The key to the front door, the key to the barn. I stared at them, the cold metal a tangible symbol of my victory. I had won. But the thought of going back there, to that empty house full of ghosts and fresh wounds, felt wrong. It wasn't time. The legal battle was over, but the mission wasn't complete. I picked up the heavy brass key to the front door and slid it back across the table to him. David looked at me, confused. Amy. Hold on to this for me, I said. I'll only go back when it's truly mine again. 6 months after the final hearing, David finally gave me back the key to the farmhouse. I drove out on a cool autumn afternoon, the sky a brilliant, cloudless blue. I parked my truck at the top of the long gravel driveway and walked to the crest of the hill, the same spot where my father used to stand to survey his land. It was all mine now. The legal fight was over. Gordon had taken a plea deal to avoid a federal trial, selling off his assets to pay his legal fees. He and Clarissa had left Seward in disgrace, vanishing from my life as completely as if they'd never existed. I stood there for a long time, looking down at the silent, empty farmhouse. The victory I'd fought so hard for didn't taste sweet. It didn't taste like anything at all. It was just quiet. The house looked smaller than I remembered, a lonely white box surrounded by fields of harvested corn. There was no triumph in standing here alone. There was only a profound, hollow emptiness. The war was won, the enemy was gone. But now I was a soldier, left alone on a silent battlefield. I looked at the key in my hand and asked the quiet air the same question I'd asked myself months ago on the highway out of town. What now? I walked down the hill and let myself into the house. It was just as Clarissa had left it, but stripped of all personal effects. It felt like a stage after the play has ended. I wandered through the rooms, my footsteps echoing on the bare wood floors. But I didn't feel any connection here. The real feeling of home, I realized, wasn't in the house. It was outside. I spent the rest of the afternoon walking the property, my boots sinking into the rich, dark soil. I ran my hand along the top rail of a fence, its wood weathered to a soft gray, and remembered the summer my father and I had built it together, our hands sore and our faces sunburned. I remembered the deep, quiet satisfaction of physical labor, the feeling of creating something strong and lasting with your own 2 hands. I remembered the peace that came from working the land. As the sun began to set, casting long golden rays across the fields, I thought of Sarge Henderson and his simple, life-altering question. Have you eaten dinner? I thought of Maria's warm kitchen. And then I thought of the soldiers I had served with. The young men and women who came home from the chaos of war only to find themselves lost in the quiet of civilian life, struggling to find a new mission, a new purpose. I thought about how many of them came from farming backgrounds, how a connection to the land was written into their DNA, and how that connection was severed when they put on a uniform. An idea began to form, not as a flash of lightning, but as a slow, steady dawn breaking over the horizon of my mind. This farm, this land, it shouldn't be a monument to a painful past. It shouldn't be a prize I'd won in a bitter family war. It needed to be a launching pad for the future. My father had left me this land as a legacy. Now it was up to me to decide what that legacy would be. 1 year later, I stood on that same porch, but the view was completely different. The silence was gone, replaced by the sound of laughter and easy conversation. The emptiness was gone, replaced by life. A new, beautifully carved wooden sign stood at the entrance to the driveway. It read, Walsh Valor Retreat. And underneath, a simple, powerful slogan. Holding the line. In partnership with a national nonprofit, the Farmer Veteran Coalition, we had transformed the farm. It was now a transitional therapeutic center for returning service members. The front yard was no longer just grass. It was filled with veterans and their families. Over by the newly repaired barn, a small group was learning the basics of equine therapy, their quiet focus on the horses a form of meditation. In the vast fields behind the house, others were working in a large community garden, their hands in the soil, learning to cultivate and grow, not just plants, but a new sense of purpose. A few small families were simply sitting on picnic blankets, reconnecting in a place that felt safe, surrounded by people who understood their journey without a single word needing to be spoken. I watched it all, my heart full to the point of breaking. An older gentleman came to stand beside me, leaning against the porch railing. It was Judge Ellison, now retired. He looked out at the scene, a soft smile on his face. He didn't say anything, just gave a quiet, approving nod. From inside the house, the incredible smell of Sarge Henderson's famous beef stew wafted out. He and Maria were in the kitchen, volunteering their time, serving food that healed more than just hunger. They had become the heart of this place. My gaze drifted to the wall inside the living room, where my father's portrait now hung in a place of honor. I looked at his kind, steady eyes and knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that he would be proud. The land wasn't just producing corn anymore, it was producing hope. My war was over. The fight for my inheritance, for my name, for my very existence, was done. But my mission, the mission to hold the line for my brothers and sisters in arms, to give them a place to regroup and find their own way forward, that had just begun. My family had tried to erase me, to write me out of the story. They failed. Instead, I had picked up the pen and written a new legacy, not just for me, but for all of us. And it was a legacy of valor, of resilience, and of coming home. Thank you for listening to my story. My battle for the farm is over, but I learned that the most important ground we can ever hold is the one we build for ourselves, surrounded by the people we choose. Everyone has a front line they have to hold, and I truly believe no one should have to do it alone. In the comments, I'd love to hear about just one person who became the family you chose when you needed it most. If you believe that our past does not have to define our future, please hit the like button and subscribe for more stories of resilience and new beginnings. Thank you for being part of my squad today.